The San Diego sun, a relentless glare even in early November, beat down on the steps of the Superior Court. Naomi Prescott adjusted the collar of her simple white blouse, the starched cotton a stark contrast to the simmering heat beneath. Her movements were economical, precise, honed by years of discipline. She wasn't here to make a statement with her clothes. Her presence alone was enough. Darius needs me, she thought, the thought a hard knot in her gut. He needed to be a rock. The security line snaked around the corner, a slow, shuffling queue of humanity. Naomi fell into place, the weight of the gazes upon her back a tangible pressure. She knew the looks weren't assessing the threat she posed. They were cataloging her, dissecting her, placing her in a box before she even reached the metal detector. Just another statistic, a cynical voice whispered in her head. She pushed it down, focusing on the rhythm of her own breathing, a technique honed over years of high-stress situations. In holdout. Control. Ma'am, you'll need to take off your watch and belt. The security officer barked, his voice flat, impersonal. He didn't look her in the eye, his gaze flitting over her as if she were an inanimate object to be processed. No belt, Naomi replied, her voice equally flat. The watch doesn't come off. Military issue. The words hung in the air, a challenge and an explanation all at once. Inside, a flicker of irritation sparked, swiftly followed by a familiar weariness. This again, she thought. How many times? It never stopped. The constant, low-grade hum of suspicion that followed her like a shadow. The officer finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as they took in the simple lines of her clothes, the close-cropped hair, the unwavering gaze. He reached out a hand towards the watch, his fingers hovering just above the crystal. "We need to check it, ma'am." Naomi's hand instinctively went to the watch, her fingers tracing the inscription on the back, for valor, for service, for family. The cool metal under her fingertips was a grounding force, a reminder of who she was, of what she'd earned. "This watch," she stated, each word clipped and precise, "has seen more action than you can imagine. It's not coming off." The officer hesitated, the challenge in her voice, the quiet strength in her stance, finally registering. He squinted, trying to decipher the faint engraving. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a subtle shift in his demeanor. "Military?" he asked, his tone softer now, laced with a newfound respect, but still tainted with an underlying wariness. "Lieutenant Commander, United States Navy," she replied, the words not a boast, but a simple statement of fact. A bead of silence hung between them, thick with unspoken assumptions, with the weight of history. He stepped back, waving her through. "Go ahead, ma'am." The apology remained unspoken, lost in the awkward shuffle of bodies moving through the metal detector. Naomi stepped through the archway, the cold metal against her skin a jarring reminder of the cage she was entering. The courtroom doors loomed ahead, heavy oak doors that seemed to absorb the sunlight, leaving only shadows in their wake. Darius, she thought, the name a prayer on her lips. "I'm here." The arraignment was a blur of legalese and hushed whispers. Naomi sat stiffly in the back row, her gaze fixed on her brother. Darius sat hunched over at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. The public defender, a young woman with tired eyes, murmured something in his ear, her hand resting reassuringly on his arm. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured man in a tailored suit, paced before the judge, his voice rising and falling in practiced cadences. He painted a picture of Darius as a threat, a danger to society, a man who needed to be locked away. Naomi's jaw clenched, her fists tightening in her lap. "Liar," she thought, the word a bitter taste in her mouth. "He doesn't know him. He doesn't know anything." The judge, a heavy-set man in his 60s with a face etched with years of courtroom dramas, listened impassively, his gaze sweeping across the room. He settled on Naomi, his eyes lingering for a moment, then moved on. The subtle scrutiny, the unspoken judgment, it was all so familiar. As the prosecutor continued his relentless attack, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. A bailiff, his face flushed with anger, was shouting at Naomi. "You! What are you doing here? You're disrupting the proceedings." Confusion warred with a rising tide of anger within her. "I'm here for my brother's arraignment," she stated, her voice tight with controlled fury. "This is ridiculous." "Don't lie to me," the bailiff sneered, his hand reaching for her arm. "You fit the description of suspect in an ongoing investigation. You're under arrest." The public defender jumped to her feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. This woman is a witness, Lieutenant Commander Prescott, a decorated Navy SEAL." The judge looked startled, his gaze flickering between the bailiff and Naomi. The prosecutor, sensing an opportunity, chimed in. "Your Honor, I request that this individual be removed from the courtroom. Her presence is clearly disruptive." Before the judge could respond, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the courtroom silence. "Lieutenant Commander Prescott is not disrupting anything. She is where she has every right to be." Every head turned towards the entrance. Standing there, his uniform impeccable, his bearing commanding, was Admiral Russell Kincaid, a four-star admiral whose name resonated with power and respect. The courtroom air crackled with tension. The bailiff, his face now ashen, stammered, "Admiral, I didn't—" Admiral Kincaid's gaze swept over the bailiff, the judge, the prosecutor, each look a silent reprimand. He then turned to Naomi, his expression softening. "Commander Prescott, I apologize for this misunderstanding. I believe you had something to say to the court." Naomi stood, her spine straight, her gaze steady. The rage still simmered beneath the surface, but it was now tempered with a steely resolve. She looked at her brother, her expression softening with a love that transcended the courtroom drama. Then, she turned back to the judge, her voice clear and strong. "My brother," she began, "made a mistake. He's paying for it, but he's not a danger to anyone. He's a good man, a loyal son, a loving brother, and he deserves a fair chance." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom, taking in the faces, the whispers, the judgment. "And for the record," she added, her voice ringing with quiet power, "I've served this country for 15 years, putting my life on the line for the very freedoms this court is supposed to uphold. Today, I was treated like a criminal simply for being who I am." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The metal detector emitted a shrill beep. Naomi Prescott's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Of all the sounds that grated on her nerves, this high-pitched whine was near the top. It reminded her of drills, of alarms, of situations far more precarious than a courthouse security checkpoint. Just another hoop, she thought, her inner voice a dry rustle against the rising tide of frustration. Another reminder of where I don't belong. She glanced down at her watch, a heavy, utilitarian piece that had seen more action than most of the people in this building. It was more than a timepiece. It was an extension of her, a silent testament to years spent navigating the unforgiving currents of her career. The bailiff, a man whose middle-aged paunch strained against his uniform, gestured impatiently. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some ID, and that watch needs to come off." He spoke with the practiced boredom of someone who performed this ritual daily, yet his gaze lingered on Naomi a beat too long. A look she knew all too well. A look that saw not the lieutenant commander, the decorated SEAL, but something else. Something other. A flicker of something cold, almost reptilian, stirred within her. Years of discipline, of burying emotions beneath layers of stoicism, almost cracked. "Breathe, Prescott," she commanded herself silently. "This isn't worth it." With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken battles, she unclasped the watch, placing it with exaggerated care in the plastic tray. The cool metal of the tray against her skin felt foreign, a stark contrast to the familiar weight it usually bore. She stepped through the detector, steeling herself for the next inevitable hurdle. The machine remained silent this time. For a moment, she allowed herself the smallest sliver of hope, a foolish, fleeting wish that this might just be a normal day, that she might simply fulfill her duty as a witness, support her brother, and disappear back into the anonymity she craved. The bailiff's voice, thick with suspicion, shattered that illusion. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some ID." He held out his hand, his fingers tapping impatiently against his palm. Naomi's hand instinctively went to her breast pocket, where her military ID resided. But something held her back. A quiet rebellion simmered beneath her calm exterior. She presented her driver's license instead. The bailiff scrutinized the plastic card, his lips pursing into a thin line. "This ain't base. Got any real ID?" The words dripped with condescension, each syllable a tiny barb aimed at her very existence. The cold, reptilian thing within her uncoiled a little further. "I'm a federal witness," she stated, her voice even controlled. "Here for my brother's arraignment." The truth, plain and simple. Yet, in his eyes, she saw doubt, disbelief. He wanted more. He needed more. "He needs to put me in my place." The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. "I said get up now." The command, sharp and edged with authority, cut through the murmuring hum of the courthouse hallway. Naomi, still seated on the bench provided for witnesses, slowly met the bailiff's gaze. The handcuffs, dangling from his hand, glinted under the fluorescent lights, a stark symbol of the power he wielded, the power she was expected to yield to. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the escalating tension. Among them, a teenager held up a phone, its screen reflecting the unfolding scene. "This is it," a voice whispered in the back of Naomi's mind. "This is the moment they've been waiting for." Inside, a storm raged, fury warred with icy control. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, curious, judgmental, some tinged with a morbid fascination. She could feel the weight of her brother's fate resting on her shoulders, the silent plea in his eyes from their earlier encounter in the holding cell. And beneath it all, the insidious, familiar burn of injustice. She had faced down enemy combatants, navigated treacherous waters, stared death in the face without flinching. Yet here, in this sterile, supposedly civilized space, she felt a different kind of danger. A danger that chipped away at her dignity, her sense of self. "Sir, my client is a witness." The public defender's voice, reedy but firm, broke through the tense silence. "She's here to testify. There must be some mistake." The bailiff's face flushed a deeper shade of red. "She's being uncooperative, resisting arrest." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, picturing Darius, his face pale and drawn, his hope pinned on her. For him, she thought, "I have to do this for him." When she opened her eyes, her gaze was steady, unwavering. "I will not comply with an unlawful arrest." Her voice, though quiet, resonated with an authority that surprised even herself. The bailiff's hesitation was infinitesimal, but she saw it. A flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then, with a jerk, he yanked her to her feet, the cold metal of the cuffs biting into her wrists. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. The teenager's phone continued to record, capturing the image of a decorated Navy SEAL, unjustly restrained, her dignity stripped bare in the hallway of a courthouse. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman with calculating eyes, watched the scene unfold with a detached amusement. The judge, a heavy-set man whose face seemed permanently creased with a mixture of boredom and exasperation, emerged from the courtroom, drawn by the commotion. He surveyed the scene with a frown. "What in God's name is going on here?" Before the bailiff could stammer out a response, a deep voice cut through the air. "That, Your Honor, is Lieutenant Commander Naomi Prescott, a highly decorated Navy SEAL and a war hero." Admiral Russell Kincaid strode down the hallway, his presence radiating an aura of quiet power. The 4 stars on his uniform gleamed under the fluorescent lights, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. He stopped before Naomi, his eyes, though filled with a controlled fury, held a deep understanding. "She is also, as you were informed, a federal witness." The bailiff's face paled. The judge, now fully comprehending the gravity of the situation, sputtered apologies. The handcuffs were removed, the apologies continued, profuse and laced with a newfound respect. The prosecutor's amusement had vanished. replaced by a look of thinly veiled annoyance. The teenager's phone, still recording, captured the Admiral's hand on Naomi's shoulder, a silent gesture of support, of solidarity. "Commander Prescott," the judge addressed her, his voice now laced with deference. "I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding. Please, proceed into the courtroom. Your testimony is critical." Naomi, her wrists throbbing with the phantom ache of the cuffs, nodded curtly. As she entered the courtroom, she paused, her gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. The prosecutor, the public defender, her brother Darius, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. She took a deep breath, the cold, reptilian thing within her finally settling. "My brother," she began, her voice clear and strong, "is a good man. He made a mistake, a serious one. But he deserves justice, not prejudice. And so do I. And so do so many others who look like me, who serve this country with honor, yet are still treated like suspects." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths, challenging the silence, demanding to be heard. The stale air of courtroom 3A hung heavy, thick with the scent of cheap coffee and the hushed anxieties of those awaiting judgment. Darius Prescott sat hunched on the hard wooden bench, the weight of the room pressing down on him, each ticking second an echo of his impending fate. His hands, calloused from years of working the docks, clenched and unclenched, a nervous rhythm against the worn fabric of his trousers. He'd replayed this moment 1,000 times in his head, the sterile formality of the courtroom, the accusatory whispers, the crushing weight of his mistake. But none of those imagined scenarios prepared him for the metallic clang of the courtroom door and the sharp intake of breath that rippled through the gallery. A commotion erupted near the entrance. Darius craned his neck, his heart hammering against his ribs. Two figures wrestled near the door, the glint of metal flashing under the fluorescent lights. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through his numbness. It was then he saw her, his sister Naomi, her wrists bound, her face a mask of controlled fury. The bailiff, a middle-aged man with a face like a weathered boot, held her arm in a grip that looked unnecessarily tight. Something inside Darius snapped. He surged to his feet, the sudden movement drawing the attention of the room. "That's my sister," he blurted out, his voice cracking with desperation. "She's my witness." His words hung in the air, a fragile shield against the rising tide of injustice. Naomi? What the hell is happening? He couldn't fathom why she was being treated like a criminal. The judge, a heavy-set man whose jowls quivered with each ponderous breath, shifted in his high-backed chair. Confusion furrowed his brow, momentarily disrupting the practiced neutrality of his expression. "What's going on, bailiff?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of impatience. The bailiff, his face flushed, pulled Naomi closer. "Resisting arrest, Your Honor, causing a disturbance outside the courtroom." He spoke with the self-assuredness of a man accustomed to his authority. Naomi's eyes, usually warm and full of laughter, burned with a cold fire. Darius had seen that look before, the simmering rage that lay beneath her disciplined exterior. It was the look she wore in the face of danger, the look that had earned her respect and fear in equal measure. "Don't react. Naomi," he pleaded silently. "Don't give them what they want." He knew she was capable of unleashing a storm, but this was not the time, not the place. Darius's public defender, a young woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, stepped forward. "Your Honor, this is Lieutenant Commander Naomi Prescott," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmuring courtroom. "She's a decorated Navy SEAL and a key witness for the defense." Each word was a carefully aimed strike, dismantling the bailiff's narrative piece by piece. The title hung in the air, a sudden shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. The judge's confusion deepened, replaced by a dawning realization. The bailiff's grip on Naomi's arm loosened, his face paling beneath the ruddy complexion. A murmur rippled through the gallery, the whispers now laced with disbelief. A Navy SEAL? Handcuffed? The incongruity of the scene settled over the room like a thick fog. Naomi stood rigid, her body a coiled spring. The handcuffs chafed against her wrists, a physical manifestation of the indignity. Breathe, she told herself, the word a mantra against the rising tide of fury. Breathe and wait. She had faced down enemy combatants, endured grueling training, stared death in the face without flinching. This, she told herself, was just another battle, a different kind of war. The prosecutor, a man whose tailored suit couldn't quite disguise the predatory gleam in his eyes, cleared his throat. Lieutenant Commander or not, he began, his voice smooth and condescending. Obstructing justice is a serious offense. He glanced at Darius, his expression a subtle blend of accusation and triumph. Perhaps her presence here isn't entirely coincidental. A coordinated attempt to disrupt proceedings, perhaps. He let the question hang in the air, a poisonous seed of doubt. Naomi's jaw tightened. She wanted to wipe the smug look off his face, to remind him that she had faced far greater threats than his petty courtroom games. But she held herself in check, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the judge's head. Patience, Naomi. She could feel the weight of her brother's gaze on her, his silent plea for calm. The judge, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, addressed the bailiff. Release Lieutenant Commander Prescott immediately. His voice, though still laced with authority, now held a note of apology. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. He looked at Naomi, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and regret. My apologies, Commander. This should not have happened. The bailiff, his face now a mask of shame, fumbled with the handcuffs, his fingers clumsy and slow. Naomi felt the metal click open, the release a physical manifestation of the shift in power. She rubbed her wrists, the phantom pressure a reminder of the injustice. Commander Prescott, the judge continued, his voice regaining its composure. Would you please take the stand? Naomi nodded, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. The prosecutor's smugness had evaporated, replaced by a flicker of unease. The public defender wore a small, satisfied smile, and Darius, his shoulders slightly less slumped, met her gaze with a mixture of relief and gratitude. As she took her place on the witness stand, Naomi allowed herself a single, deep breath. The fight wasn't over. She had a story to tell, a brother to defend, and a system to challenge. And she would do it with the same unwavering strength and resilience she had brought to every battle she had ever faced. She raised her hand, ready to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The weight of the room still pressed down, but now she felt a different kind of weight, the weight of responsibility, the weight of hope. The stale, recycled air of courtroom 3A hummed with a low, anxious buzz. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile glare over the worn wooden benches, occupied by a scattering of restless individuals. Naomi Prescott stood handcuffed, the cool metal biting into her wrists, a stark contrast to the simmering heat rising within her. Comply. The bailiff's word echoed in her mind, each syllable a tiny barb tugging at the tightly wound coil of her control. Comply meant accepting the injustice, swallowing the bitter taste of prejudice. Her jaw tightened, a barely perceptible clench. She'd complied with orders her entire life, orders that sent her into the darkest corners of the world, orders that demanded blood and sacrifice. But this felt different. This was a violation not of her body, but of her very being. Darius, her younger brother, sat hunched at the defendant's table, his face a mask of fear and confusion. Naomi could feel the weight of his gaze on her, a silent plea for help she couldn't immediately answer. The public defender, a young woman with tired eyes, was arguing with the bailiff, her voice rising above the hushed murmurs of the courtroom. She showed her military credentials, the defender insisted, her frustration evident. She said she's a SEAL. She wouldn't comply. The bailiff retorted, his face flushed. He adjusted his belt, the gesture radiating a nervous energy that betrayed his own unease. She was standing in the hallway and refused to show proper ID. Naomi's internal monologue was a storm of conflicting emotions. Rage warred with icy calm. The urge to lash out, to make this man understand the depth of his ignorance, battled with the ingrained discipline that demanded she maintain control. Breathe, she told herself. Control. This wasn't the battlefield, but the courtroom, with its hushed whispers and judging eyes, felt like a different kind of war zone. The judge, a heavy-set man in his late 60s, looked from the bailiff to Naomi, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. He adjusted his glasses, the movement slow and deliberate. Officer, are you saying you arrested Lieutenant Commander Prescott because she didn't look like what you expected a Navy SEAL to look like? The bailiff stammered, his face reddening further. Your Honor, he trailed off, unable to articulate the prejudiced assumptions that had led him to detain a decorated officer. The public defender stepped forward, her voice gaining a sharper edge. My client, Mr. Prescott, is already facing a difficult situation. His sister, a highly decorated member of the United States Navy, came here to support him, and she was unjustly detained based on nothing more than. She paused, searching for the right word, her gaze briefly meeting Naomi's. Bias, she finished, the word hanging heavy in the air. Naomi closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, the metallic scent of the handcuffs filling her nostrils. The prosecutor, a man with a hawk-like face, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of the elephant in the room. The fact that a black woman, standing tall and proud in a crisp uniform, didn't fit the mental image of a Navy SEAL had led to this absurd situation. The judge cleared his throat. Officer, he began, his voice stern. Where's Lieutenant Commander Prescott's identification? It was taken during processing, Your Honor, the bailiff mumbled, avoiding Naomi's gaze. Processing. The word churned in Naomi's mind. Processed like a common criminal. Her service, her sacrifices, reduced to nothing. The injustice of it burned, a slow, steady fire in the pit of her stomach. Just then, the courtroom doors swung open, admitting a figure that commanded immediate attention. Admiral Russell Kincaid, a four-star admiral whose presence radiated authority and power, strode into the room. The air in the courtroom seemed to shift, the hushed whispers replaced by a stunned silence. The judge, visibly startled, rose from his seat. Admiral Kincaid, he stammered. To what do we owe this honor? The admiral's gaze swept across the room, settling on Naomi. I'm here for Lieutenant Commander Prescott, he stated, his voice resonant and clear. He turned to the judge, his expression hardening. I understand there's been a misunderstanding. The bailiff, his face now ashen, shrank back against the wall. The prosecutor's jaw dropped. Darius's eyes widened in disbelief. Admiral Kincaid approached Naomi, his expression softening. Commander Prescott, he said, his voice low, I apologize for this egregious error. Naomi met his gaze, the icy calm she had maintained beginning to thaw. Thank you, Admiral, she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. The Admiral turned to the judge. Lieutenant Commander Prescott didn't just earn her place in the SEAL teams, he stated, his voice ringing with authority. She bled for it. She's a war hero, a leader, and a damn fine officer. And she deserves a hell of a lot more respect than this. He gestured towards the handcuffs. Now, if you'll kindly release her, I believe Commander Prescott has something to say to the court regarding her brother. The judge, his face flushed with embarrassment, immediately ordered the bailiff to remove the handcuffs. As the metal clinked against the floor, Naomi felt a surge of relief, mingled with the lingering sting of injustice. Rubbing her wrists, she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on her brother. Darius, she began, her voice soft yet firm, you made a mistake. We all make mistakes, but you're not a bad person, and you deserve a second chance. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom, meeting the eyes of the judge, the prosecutor, and the hushed spectators. We all deserve a second chance, she continued, her voice gaining strength. But not everyone gets one. Not everyone gets the benefit of the doubt. Not everyone gets seen for who they are, rather than what they appear to be. Her voice resonated with a quiet power, a testament to her resilience and the weight of her experience. The courtroom remained silent, held captive by her words, the unspoken truths hanging heavy in the air. The scene, once a testament to prejudice and ignorance, had transformed into a stage for a different kind of justice. A justice not only for her brother, but for herself and for all those who had been judged by the color of their skin, rather than the content of their character. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 3A hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the tension crackling in the air. Tuesday morning, Naomi Prescott stood rigid, the crisp lines of her navy dress uniform a stark contrast to the rumpled attire of the other courtroom occupants. Her jaw was tight, a muscle ticking beneath the smooth, dark skin of her cheek. "Stay calm," she told herself, the words a mantra against the rising tide of fury. "You're here for Darius." Her brother sat hunched at the defendant's table, shoulders slumped, the weight of the charges pressing down on him like a physical burden. He glanced at her, a flicker of fear in his eyes, and she offered a small, reassuring nod. The bailiff, a man whose jowls seemed to melt into his starched collar, loomed over her, his hand still gripping her arm. The metal of his badge was cold against her skin, a chilling reminder of the injustice that had just unfolded. "Ma'am, I need to see some ID," he repeated, his voice laced with suspicion. Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "ID? I've faced down enemy fire, navigated treacherous waters, protected this nation, and this man questions my identity?" The absurdity of it sent a bitter taste rising in her throat. Before she could respond, a voice, deep and resonant, cut through the courtroom's hushed whispers. "I apologize for the interruption, but I believe one of my officers is in your courtroom." Every head turned towards the entrance. Admiral Russell Kincaid stood there, his 4 stars gleaming on his uniform, his presence filling the room like a storm surge. The bailiff's hand instinctively released Naomi's arm. He stammered, "Admiral." Kincaid's eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on the bailiff. "Lieutenant Commander Prescott," he addressed Naomi, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Are you all right?" Naomi drew a slow, steadying breath. The Admiral's arrival was a lifeline, a beacon in the swirling chaos. "I am now, Admiral," she replied, her voice level, though the tremor of suppressed rage still vibrated within her. Kincaid turned back to the bailiff. "Care to explain why you felt the need to detain Lieutenant Commander Prescott?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The bailiff's face flushed crimson. He sputtered about protocol and suspicion, his words stumbling over each other. The judge, a heavy-set man whose jowls mirrored the bailiff's, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Naomi's internal monologue raged. "Protocol? Suspicion? Because I'm a black woman in a uniform you don't recognize? Because you can't fathom a woman of color holding such a rank? I'm not asking for regret." Kincaid's voice cut through the bailiff's rambling. "I'm asking what you're going to do about it." The words were quiet, but the power behind them was undeniable. The bailiff, now visibly sweating, mumbled an apology, his gaze darting between Kincaid and Naomi. The apology felt hollow, insufficient, a mere formality in the face of the humiliation she had endured. But she knew this was a battle she couldn't afford to lose, not here, not now. She needed to focus on Darius. The judge cleared his throat, his voice a nervous tremor. "Lieutenant Commander Prescott, we apologize for this misunderstanding. Please proceed with your testimony." Naomi took her place on the witness stand, the wood cool beneath her hand. She met her brother's anxious gaze and offered a reassuring nod. "For you, Darius, I'm here to tell you the truth," she began, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the suddenly silent courtroom, "about who he is, what he's done, and why he deserves a chance to do better." She spoke of Darius, not as the defendant portrayed by the prosecutor, a menace to society, but as the boy she knew, loyal, protective, fiercely devoted to his friends. She spoke of the incident that landed him in court, an act of misguided loyalty, an attempt to protect a friend caught in a dangerous situation. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman with a voice like polished ice, had painted a picture of calculated aggression. Naomi chipped away at that image, revealing the fear, the desperation, the flawed judgment of a young man trying to do the right thing in a world that often felt stacked against him. She spoke of her own experiences, the uphill battles she'd faced as a woman of color in the military, the constant need to prove herself, to exceed expectations, just to be seen as equal. She spoke of the ingrained biases, the subtle slights, the outright prejudice she'd encountered, the weight of constantly having to carry the burden of representation. Her voice never wavered. Her gaze never faltered. She spoke her truth, raw and unflinching, laying bare the systemic issues that had shaped both her and her brother's lives. The courtroom was silent, captivated by her words. Even the prosecutor seemed to have lost some of her icy composure. The judge listened intently, his expression thoughtful. Darius watched his sister, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and pain. Naomi's testimony wasn't just about Darius. It was about the invisible walls that divided them, the unspoken prejudices that shaped their destinies. It was about the fight for justice, for equality, for a world where a person's skin color and gender didn't predetermine their fate. She knew her words wouldn't magically erase the injustices they'd faced, but she hoped, prayed, that they would plant a seed of understanding, a spark of change in the hearts of those who listened. Because silence, she knew, was complicity, and she refused to be silent any longer. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 3A hummed, a dull, insistent drone that mirrored the tension coiling in Naomi's gut. Her brother, Darius, stood before the judge, his shoulders slumped, the orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the crisp white of her own uniform. He was speaking now, his voice low but steady, admitting his mistakes, acknowledging the pain he'd caused. Naomi watched him, her heart a strange mix of pride and aching sorrow. He was growing, changing, but at what cost? She knew the system, its cold indifference, its tendency to chew up and spit out young black men like Darius. "I understand the severity of my actions, Your Honor," Darius said, his gaze meeting the judge's. "I've spent a lot of time trying to prove I'm not what people expect me to be." A flicker of defiance crossed his face, so fleeting Naomi almost missed it. "If you're going to judge me," Darius continued, his voice gaining strength, "judge all of me, not just the worst parts." Naomi's jaw tightened. Those words resonated deep within her, echoing her own battles against prejudice and preconceived notions. How many times had she been judged by the color of her skin, by her gender, before anyone even bothered to see her accomplishments, her dedication, the sacrifices she'd made for her country? The courtroom air felt thick, suffocating. The scent of stale coffee and disinfectant mingled with a metallic tang of fear, a familiar cocktail in this place. The prosecutor, a thin, sharp-faced man with a voice like polished steel, stepped forward, his words dripping with veiled accusations, painting Darius as a threat, a danger to society. Naomi's hand clenched around the edge of the wooden bench, her knuckles white. The public defender, a weary-looking woman with kind eyes, countered, her voice calm but firm, reminding the court of Darius's mitigating circumstances, his potential for rehabilitation. Back and forth they went, their words like weapons, each thrust aimed at swaying the judge's decision. The judge, a heavy-set man in his late 60s, listened impassively, his face a mask of judicial neutrality. Naomi watched him, trying to decipher the thoughts behind his impassive expression. Was he seeing Darius as an individual, or just another statistic? The uncertainty gnawed at her, a familiar unease settling in her stomach. The proceedings concluded, the judge setting a date for sentencing. Relief, sharp and fragile, pierced through Naomi's anxiety. It wasn't over, not yet, but it was a step. She rose to leave, the stiff fabric of her uniform brushing against the wooden bench. As she reached the courtroom doors, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with me," a voice said, rough and edged with authority. Naomi froze, the bailiff's grip tightening. Confusion warred with a rising tide of anger. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. The bailiff, a middle-aged white man with a ruddy complexion, looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her uniform. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, his tone dismissive. "Description?" Naomi repeated, the word laced with disbelief. She could feel the stares of the other courtroom occupants, the whispers starting to circulate. This was it, the familiar scenario playing out yet again. She was being judged, not for who she was, but for what she represented to people like this bailiff. "Just come quietly," the bailiff said, his grip tightening further, causing a sharp pain to shoot through her shoulder. The rage, banked down for so long, threatened to erupt. She thought of Darius, of the fight he was facing, of the countless other black men and women who had been unjustly targeted, their lives disrupted, their dignity stripped away. She wouldn't let this happen. Not this time. "Get your hands off me," she said, her voice icy. "I am Lieutenant Commander Naomi Prescott, United States Navy SEALs." The bailiff scoffed. "Sure you are, lady." He reached for his handcuffs. "Call Admiral Russell Kincaid," Naomi said, her voice cutting through the murmuring crowd. "He'll confirm my identity." The bailiff hesitated, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. The public defender, having witnessed the exchange, stepped forward. "Officer, I believe there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice calm but firm. The judge, who had been observing the scene from the bench, finally intervened. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his voice laced with authority. Before the bailiff could respond, a hush fell over the courtroom as a figure in a crisp, four-star admiral's uniform strode through the doors. Admiral Kincaid, his face grim, walked directly to Naomi. "Commander Prescott," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I understand there's been an issue." The bailiff's face paled. The judge's jaw dropped. The prosecutor and public defender exchanged stunned glances. The air crackled with tension. The admiral turned to the bailiff, his gaze sharp and unwavering. The bailiff stammered an apology, his face flushed with embarrassment. The judge, recovering his composure, also apologized, acknowledging the implicit bias that had led to this humiliating incident. Naomi stood tall, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. The shame and anger still simmered beneath the surface, but a new emotion had joined them, a cold, hard resolve. "If I hadn't stood up for myself in that courtroom," she thought, "I would have been just another woman they wrote off." Later, outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun warm on her face, Naomi took a deep breath, the city noise a stark contrast to the hushed tension of the courtroom. Admiral Kincaid stood beside her, his expression thoughtful. "I'm sorry you had to go through that." "Naomi," he said, his voice low. Naomi met his gaze, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. "It's not over, sir," she said. "But today I made a point." The admiral nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Indeed, you did." Naomi turned to leave, the weight of the morning's events settling back on her shoulders. But this time, it felt different. It was a burden, yes, but it was also a catalyst. She had exposed the cracks in the system, the insidious nature of prejudice that still permeated every level of society. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew that she wouldn't back down. She had a brother to protect, a career to pursue, and a world to change. And she would do it all, one step at a time, one battle at a time, until the day came when no one would be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. She hailed a cab, the city lights blurring as she pulled away, leaving the courthouse behind, but carrying the weight of its lessons with her, a constant reminder of the battles yet to be fought. The ripple she'd created in that courtroom, she knew, would continue to spread, its impact yet unknown, but undeniably powerful. She headed towards her next assignment, the hum of the city a backdrop to the quiet storm brewing within her.